Thank you. And so nice to see you. It's, still funny on webinars. Can't see you, but thank you for being here. This is one of my favorite topics to speak upon. I will say, as an extra challenge today, it appears I'm losing my voice in honor of this. So, if it fades in and out, Dominique said she would send me a message and let me know, but I think we can make it. I've had a lot of hot tea, which everyone loves to do when it's 100 degrees out, right? And I'm so thrilled to see that there are a lot of adults on this call. This is great. Parts of this are also geared toward parents of younger kids, so I think we'll sort of see a full range of resources and things. But that's great because that is a special research interest of mine. I can spend a little bit more time on some projects related to that. Um, so let's get started, right? We only have an hour, and we're going to talk about sexuality, relationships, dating, all of these fun things. So let me pull up my slides. Okay. And then I also wanted to share that, you know, because sexuality and disability is such a big topic, I'm going to spend a little bit more time focusing on some of the social aspects of dating and finding love today. And I want to say that not to ignore some of the more sort of like medical parts or how are babies made and things like that. But there are, to me, right, as a psychologist, as a social science person, explaining to someone like how a baby is made is fairly straightforward, right? Like there are steps that happen and here's what goes on, and there's a little bit of deviation, but not too much. Versus if someone's like, hey, can you tell me how to get a date? You're like, poof, there is not one prescribed way of doing that because it's so individualized. And so it's a complicated science, which I really enjoy about it, but also makes it tricky to study and interesting to chat about. So for me, this topic of love and autism, and particularly researching love and autism, is really joyful. I think the turn in the past couple of decades, really with this emphasis on centering autistic voices, is so important. And I'm hoping to share some of that experience with you, especially for the parents who are listening who may have younger children, to get a sense of this community that you're headed up to join. And then, of course, we will touch on some of the weaknesses of services in this area, and yes, we will get into that. We've got it all today. So let's go ahead and get started. Here's our plan for today. Okay. We are going to talk about some big ideas that I think are really central to thinking about love and sexuality and relationships. And then we're going to talk a little bit about sort of lifespan approach. So I'm going to share a couple of activities and thoughts broken down as like kids get older and into adulthood, since that's where the primary focus of my clinical work is. I'm going to do a very brief research sampler. My goal with this webinar, so you walk away feeling like you've got some ideas of things you could try or look up, but just to give you a sense of some other things that are on the horizon. This is an area that has a lot of vibrant work going on, even if it's a tricky time to get funding. That's a separate discussion for later. And then last is resources, which is probably why most people are here. So I will make sure that we save plenty of time to do that. So briefly, I want to start with the way that I approach this work and think about this work, is using this neurodiversity affirming lens, right? So this idea that brains work all sorts of different ways, and that doesn't translate into like one way is wrong or a deficit, which has been historically sort of our medical model. But there's a lot of strengths in that, and all brains have things they're good at, things they struggle with, things that they're still learning, or they might do from sort of a different perspective. And this certainly applies to dating, accessing healthcare, all of those things. But a lot of the information we have is based on one prescribed way of having a relationship or pursuing that information. So that has created some lack of resources, we'll say, right? This is also part of why we do a lot of participatory work in my lab. We work really closely with an advisory board. In addition to our, like I was mentioned in the intro, our team has a lot of autistic individuals, neurodivergent individuals. And so that has really helped shape why we focus so much on relationships, because that has been continually like something that folks have been like, hey, this is really important. There's not enough work being done on this. So briefly, this is the stance that we're coming from. There are a lot of great strengths to this. It's very much aligned with like the human rights perspective, which I think is generally good. One challenge of this has been that oftentimes work in sexuality and relationship, including work done in my own lab, focuses a lot on folks who have more verbal communication, less support needs, and that has created another gap in services. But we'll talk a little bit about that as it's going on. Again, I think these things are improving. But we're dealing with a lot of stigma and stuff that we're coming out of. So I just want to give you the lay of the land. All right. So, love, dating, healthy relationships are very difficult to teach, right? Because they encompass so many skills, and also they're relational. So matters not just what you're doing, but what the other person is doing in response to you, right? There's also a huge range of preferences in relationships, right? So if you could think of a time when you've had a friend who's been like, meet my wonderful new partner, and you're like, wow, that is not someone I would spend time with, right? That's everyone's preference. There's different things that we look for, and those certainly change across our lifespan. And that is true for all neurotypes. Right? That's not autism specific. So why would I show you this picture of peanut butter and jelly? Because that is not actually what we're talking about today. I show this picture because it reminds me of this activity that I know I did in middle school science, and maybe some of you did, where your teacher said, give me the instructions to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? And the purpose of that was to elicit really clear communication. So, like I think I put as my first step, like put the peanut butter on the bread. And I remember my teacher taking the jar of peanut butter and standing it on my piece of bread, and it squished it. I was like, oops, that was not great, right? But part of the strength of that activity is that there is an end goal that is pretty much unspoken but shared, right? If someone hands you a jar of peanut butter on a piece of bread, you're not going to be able to eat that, and you know that. But this is also what makes it a good activity to do in a group versus a relationship, because something that people want in a relationship varies so much. I was also laughing as I made this slide because this is a stock image of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and my toddler would tell you without exclusion, like, yeah, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with like seeds in the bread is wrong. So my this falls apart already. But I think, thinking a lot about the end goal is not shared for all of us is a message I'm going to keep coming back to because it's really important. Okay. So let's talk about delivering information about relationships and love, right? Here is what I would picture sort of an ideal cycle of how this would happen. This pulls from a lot of research in the space of the gaps in access to information about relationships and autism. So we'll start up here. So one is that there would be a lot of safety and also openness in talking about relationships. That would inspire more knowledge for trusted adults, especially for young children, right? So like where we're getting this information, if it is other peers, if it's teachers, if it's parents, whoever that is, the more we know about something, it tends to drive higher levels of comfort for it. And actually, knowledge of trusted adults and comfort of trusted adults in the lives of autistic children are a really significant predictor of access to sexuality and relationship information. Probably not a big surprise. And the more knowledgeable and comfort that adults feel, the more that comes through, and the more that the kids pick up on that, and they feel more open to ask questions. And this would cycle around and around and around, right? So this is sort of our ideal cycle. I like to think this is part of what we work on and in our work and why we do it, and probably why many of you are here. It hits a couple of roadblocks, right, which I think is not maybe hugely surprising. Stigma, okay? Disability, autism specifically, yes, and also disability more broadly, and sexuality and relationships have carried a lot of stigma. And this has limited a lot of our educational approaches to talking about relationships. It has made people really nervous talking about relationships, right? Despite the very large percentage of people who have romantic relationships and or sexual relationships, because they're not the same, right? Are It's still not a skill that we talk about, right, in most types of programming. um yeah, and there's a lot of myths that underlie that I won't repeat for the moment because you probably know because you're here. But that's part of what we are overcoming, right? The second part that comes up, especially in the news cycle in the past couple of years, is there's a lot of legal limitations to this. The United States does not have a broad stance on sexuality education. It's done, state by state, and then actually too often really depends on people at a school or in a program who feel comfortable talking about relationship skills. I am calling from Massachusetts. I'm calling in from Massachusetts, hence my joke about the 100-degree weather. So if you're near me, you know what I mean. I want to bring up this report card, right? So this is from Psychus. This is a group that compiles information about sex education in the United States. It is not disability specific, right? And so the little bit of sad news that I want to start with is that all of this news looks a little bit worse in the disability space, right? That access to good information, accessible information, affirming information certainly usually gets worse in more marginalized populations. That's true in a lot of healthcare spaces, right? So let's go ahead and check out Massachusetts. There's a couple of grades here. One is for whether or not they have a sex ed requirement that it be medically accurate. One is that if is it required to be like inclusive of LGBTQ plus folks? Is there instruction on contraception? So these types of questions go into calculating these grades. Massachusetts has got D's across the board, right? So for a state, I think that often considers itself quite progressive on the books, we're actually not quite so. We've also completed a study in our lab last year where we collected IEPs from students around the state, and we went through and coded to see like, is anyone talking about, relationships, healthy relationships, sexual health in a way that's in an IEP to make it more accessible. And of the IEPs we found, we have coded so far, we're through about 45 of them. There's been one mention, right? That's not to say it's not happening at all, but it's not formalized. So that's a problem, right? That's something that we can do something about. So there's a lot of room to grow. That's how my optimist self takes this information on. We've got a lot of room for improvement, research clinically, making sure our healthcare providers feel comfortable talking about this. Excuse me. So that's something, yeah, that we're working on a whole lot. But you don't have to take my word for it, right? Any Reading Rainbow fans in the house? Me forever. Also, I'm a huge Trekkie, so this was always sort of a double dip for me. The World Health Organization has big statements on how the right to romantic relationships, sexual relationships, sexuality, information about your own body is a human right that we need to sort of defend. Many autism organizations have said this specifically. This has become a big political point. I know, right? I'm not going to ignore that. But for many of us doing the work, and probably for many of you on this call, we know this to be true. It's just finding ways to advocate for this. So, but I just want to be clear, it wasn't just me saying like, hey, guess what, guys? We should have relationship rights for all. Um, there's one sub theme of this that I find really relevant to this work that I want to bring up. And I want to mention Amy Gravino in particular on this slide. So Amy Gravino did not develop the phrase dignity of risk, but she is a self-advocate who speaks a lot about access to sexual health and resources. And this is something that she touches on. And it just always really resonates with me. And so in the disability space particularly, allowing people the opportunities to take risks and experience sort of negative outcomes, but that there's autonomy in that, right? And this is one of the biggest things that I end up having discussions about with families and adults when we talk about sexuality. Like, well, I don't want them to get their heart broken. Yes, 100%, right? That is a caring thought to have. However, a realistic part of having a relationship is that there's going to be heartbreak, right? There are studies on this, right? That I don't do this particular work, but there have been studies of like when you ask young adults ages 18 to 22, like how many of them have been broken up with in the past 6 months, it's something like 40%. How many have dumped someone else? That number is 20%, which makes me think someone is fibbing in there. But it's it's part of it, right? And part of supporting in affirming ways people to make their own decisions about relationships is like, yeah, there's going to be some risk. We cannot eliminate that. We cannot wait till there are perfect conditions to allow someone to sort of move forward, right? Should be sort of a collaborative process. So this is just a concept that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and I wanted to highlight here. And there's lots of good reading on that if you want to look that up. And Amy Gravino has a lot of great resources about relationships. And actually she's pops up in a resource I'll show you a little bit later. So there's a couple things you'll see there. Okay. Um, so the next big idea, right, and then we're going to be talking about lifespan approach in a couple of slides, is talking to yourself about sexuality and relationships. So when I do sort of like trainings at organizations, when we talk about accessible care and supporting relationships, whether you are autistic or not, thinking a little bit about your own thoughts and beliefs, like internalized about sexuality and disability, right? Are these things that are allowable? Are there certain conditions where you feel like they're allowable? And just examining where that comes from, right? That's where the psychologist in me comes out. Like, how do you feel about that? Because it's really important for us to be really brutally honest with where we're coming from, so we know what biases we may hold, how we can collaborate with other people to connect folks with information that they might have, right? Um, what hopes and dreams do you have for your child, your student, your patient, certainly yourself, right? That hopefully is a little bit easier if you're asking about yourself. But that there have been a lot of interesting studies. Actually, there's Tony Atwood is a researcher who's a parent of an autistic child in Australia. And he, for a long time, was running groups with autistic boys. And they were like 12 to 17, I think, where he said even simply asking the question about, like, what do you want for a romantic relationship when you grow up? And many of the kids said they had not been asked that question before, right? So encouraging that to start. Um, And then, in part because this has become a little bit politicized, oftentimes I actually start with the bottom question, because I think asking all humans, like, how does romantic love, how does physical intimacy, impact your day-to-day life? How is that important to you? How do we advocate for that for everybody in positive ways? Because this is such a shared experience. And so these are just some centering questions I like to present. So I'll share these with you. In a longer time frame, we would sit and unpack this a little bit, but for now, the slides will be available after this. You can go back and take a look, and maybe have some discussions with those in your life, and see where you come on some of these. Um, I'm going to share a couple of just really brief facts. This is, again, not the goal of this particular webinar, but I think it's important to get a sense of the landscape. Um, Prevalence of romantic relationships and intimacy for a really long time. There was a lot of misinformation that, like, oh, autistic people are not interested in romantic relationships, right? Hopefully, we have broken that at this point. Um, but when we ask autistic adults if they've been in romantic relationships or want intimate relationships, the majority of folks have been and or want to be in one, right? So this is something we need to be talking about. The safety piece, we can't skip over that, right? There is an increased reporting of negative sexual experiences, including abuse, trauma, in autistic and sort of disabled populations really broadly. This is something that really has not caught much intervention attention, which shocks me, right? Because the rates are thought to be like 70 times higher, and are likely more so because most of our measures for assessing safety and sexuality are very verbally based, right? So that is something that's always sort of in the back of my mind. My role in this, right, I think, is to advocate for using this positive framework. I don't center that because I think there are a lot of other benefits of relationships that are good to pursue, but obviously this is a huge concern, and something that needs more study and more resources thrown at it. Um, Access to information is huge, right? So sex ed being a little bit all over the place in the US at this point anyway. And then folks who might get, educational services may be pulled out when sex ed is offered, right? They may be attending other services. It might be offered to them, but not with the same accessibility supports that have been used in other areas, which is problematic. It might not address them particularly, especially in the adolescent and young adult part of the lifespan section we'll talk about in a second. Like, there's a lot of information suggesting that autistic relationships might have some really cool, unique aspects to them that they're not being taught about, right? And so we need to make sure the information is good, is helpful, right? Identity and autism. So we'll talk a little bit about LGBTQ identity. That's a common question that I get, so we will touch on that. That is coming up. And then preparedness, right? So how prepared do you feel like that people are in your life to help you with this? A lot of relationship information, sort of across neurotypes, is learned from peers, right? If you are someone who is relying less on peers, or maybe your peers are talking less about their romantic relationships, you still deserve access to that information. So how do we make that happen, right? Outside of this work, my lab, we do a lot of trainings of healthcare providers. So primary care provider for adults, primary care providers, OBGYNs, psychologists and psychiatrists. We created a training with autistic adults, and we certainly spend a little bit of time talking about sexuality and relationships, because there's no one who is nominated to have this discussion, right? There's no, like, if you scrape your leg and it looks like it's getting infected, you call your primary care, right? If you are breaking out all the time, you call your dermatologist. If you have a question about relationships, it's much more vague. There's no specialist being like, it's me, right? And so we're trying to empower more providers to be that person in the absence of the one assigned person. Okay. Um, this is a list in the blue box of topics that psychists, again, the sort of sex ed in the US group that we get a lot of information from, has identified as the big major topics of sex ed that could be or should be covered. We won't talk about all of these today, right? We'll focus more on some than some others. Another big question I get from folks is like, when do I start talking about this with with my kids, especially if you're here and you've got young kids, right? Um, the answer is always right now, right? Relationships happen all the time. This is a scaffolded skill. I try to draw the parallel when you get to high school. Hopefully, no one was like, and now you will learn calculus when you hadn't learned to add or subtract or divide, right? Um, and so, same thing with relationships. It starts with learning about like consent and boundaries when you're little. And when you're learning about that when you're young, that will translate into relationships when you're older, and so on and so forth. Okay. Um, but that you want to be the go-to, right? So whether you're on here as a parent or a self-advocate, right? Like you want to be the person who knows where to find the information, how to model that if you want to or need to. And you don't need to study first, right? That like this is an ongoing process. I've never heard someone come in like, you know what, Dr. Korean, now I am ready to be an expert on sex ed, myself included, right? I've got a toddler who asks me questions all the time, like, wow, I've got no idea, right? Which is makes my husband laugh at me since he's like, don't you do this professionally? You guys are fine. I promise this information is good. Using direct and clear language at any age, right? And I would imagine, although the chat's not open that way in here, that we could get some good examples from autistic adults where maybe someone was actually sharing some good information about relationships, but the language was vague or communication with a partner was like sort of more neurotypical and not clear. Like so that being direct and vague. We'll talk a little bit about language. And then creating some support, right? Who will join you on pursuing some of the goals that you have for yourself, for your kids, to really make sure that we're pursuing relationships in, yeah, supportive and affirming ways. Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about sort of by age how this looks, and I might spend a little bit less time on the slightly younger ages just because of the audience that we have here, but certainly happy to answer questions if you want to pop them in the Q&A as we go, okay? So for younger kids, right? You could start already talking a lot about body parts, right? What are the names of your body parts? This is people ask a lot like what do I use, like the scientifically accurate terms like penis and vulva and vagina and things like that, or do I use what my kids might be using, right? And the answer is both, right? We want to tell kids what the sort of accurate terms are so that they can communicate that with other people, but then also what their peers will be using and when we can use both, right? One thing that is a big challenge is that too often if people use communication devices, they don't have a way to communicate about genitals, right? um that's not good, right? Because they can't tell us good stuff and they can't tell us bad stuff, right? If there's not a way to communicate about that. So making sure that everyone has access to that, to communicating about their own body is really important when kids are young and it gets them comfortable with it. um Boundaries is another good one to practice here. So, we're thinking long term as we're headed toward intimate relationships, but this is also true when kids are younger, right? Giving opportunities for kids to say no, which might be extra funny. Like I said, I'm living the toddler life right now, so all she does is say no, right? But when is it okay to be like, okay, yes, let's listen to that, especially in disability where there are a lot of compliance-based programs, making sure we're offsetting that in important ways, right? Here's one example from a program I did not develop on my own, but that we use a lot. It's a sex ed program for autistic teens. It's the sort of blueprint of someone's house. And the activity in this curriculum is going through and labeling like which behaviors can happen in which room, right? So this was developed initially to talk about masturbation, right? So, this was, I think Tom is the character in this. It's Sarah and Tom are the siblings in the story. So Tom, you can masturbate in your bedroom with the door closed, right? And so we would label that in a certain way. But for younger kids also, like a lot of fun stuff. You can play with your toys in this room, but not in the bathroom, maybe, right? You can take a bath in the bathroom, but you can't do that in the living room, things like that. So just starting to make really explicit some of the unwritten rules, right? Like the social rules, like where can you be naked, right? And when, and if we have company, can you be naked in the garden? That sort of stuff. So finding some ways to start to define spaces around like all sorts of behaviors, not just sexual and intimate ones that might come later. Okay. Um, the other big one, tool that I like to talk about at this point is the circles program. And so this is a nice visual because me is the person at the center of this. This is a structure that you can use across the lifespan, right? But starting when kids are little, first of all, it's a really cute color scheme, but also makes it a little bit easier. So the second circle is family, then friends, then acquaintances. So people you may know, but don't really know well. Community helpers, so you know them and you have a lot of contact with them, but you don't have maybe a personal relationship with them that's sort of defined by some work. And then strangers, and then you would go in like in, ideally this is on the wall, and you can maybe have, pictures of the people or their names depending on what is most understandable for you. And then you can define the different behaviors that are appropriate on there, right? And by appropriate I mean safe, right? People who are good to go to with questions. So like for example, with family, it might be like, oh, can you, let's go back to the naked question, right? Oh, you can be naked with family, but not with friends. And so that way, if you're in a situation where your little one is getting naked, be like, oh, like we're in a circle with green people right now with our friends. That's not how we do that. So just to help make it really visual can be really good. And this, you can do this with anything, right? This you could also use for like some of the terminology as kids get older. Like let's say instead of penis, they're saying dick with their friends. Common. That's what little kids do, or slightly older kids do once they learn that. Be like, okay, that's okay with friends, but not with community helpers, and then you can decide what you do with your family, right? I'm going to give you a little sneak peek of what this can look like as folks get older, um, and this is adapted for romantic relationships, right? So like self-intimacy being first, so understanding yourself and what you like and what you don't like, and then moving outward, getting sort of like less serious or significant, dating relationships. So this is a model you can use in a lot of different directions, right? So anything from friendships to casual dating like that. Okay. Um, Another really important idea at this age is introducing kids to different family constellations, right? You can use that through books, through media. There's a couple of suggestions here I have for folks to read. So the bottom one, A Mighty Girl, actually has a list of books that talk about different relationships and sort of identities in kid-friendly ways. I have a lot of books from them on my shelf, and they've just compiled a list. They don't actually write them. But really using the word some when you can, right? So like for example, like I have a sibling who has a female partner, and so my daughter, when she's like, oh, she's like, well, mommy and daddy are married. I was like, that's true, but like some people have partners who are a different gender, or using that word some, that can introduce a little bit of flexibility around these ideas, in part because, as we'll talk about, identity is a lot more diverse in autistic groups, so we want to sort of lay the foundation for that. um, if you're a parent in this group, particularly, reading Sincerely Your Autistic Child can be a really powerful read. This is not about romantic relationships in particular, but it is letters from autistic adults written in retrospect to their parents, and some of like the wonderful bonds and some of the negative experiences they had. This can be a really good read at this age. Um, there's also a book called Teaching Children with Down Syndrome about their bodies, boundaries, and sexuality. Yes, this is about Down syndrome, right? Down syndrome, that community tends to be a little bit further ahead in thinking about relationship rights and things than the autism community. And this is great for really young children because it's very visual. There's a lot of like, what are the different parts of your body? So I actually pull a lot of exercises from that, just because the format of it is very appropriate for young children. Um, so that's your younger kid recommendation really briefly, okay? So let's talk about what I'm going to call almost puberty, because once puberty hits, we've got a whole bunch of stuff we definitely get into. But this is where I like to really think about building sort of autonomy and self-understanding and preparing for some of the hormonal fluctuations that are coming for sure. but also normalizing that puberty is coming across all topics, but especially things like sexual health and romantic relationships. We generally talk about those with children after things have already happened, right? Which is not the most comforting way to do it. So body parts, where we started with young children, moving on to puberty and how changes are going to happen, right? We ran a very successful actually pilot program last year where we made puberty kits for people who had not yet started puberty but were getting ready to, that included some information for parents, but also included ways to sort of like practice and expose people to period products. So we had pads, we had tampons, we got the period underwear that's like really absorbent, um, to prepare people for what that might be like, right? Oftentimes when we talk about like using a pad, for example, it's the first day someone has a period. And so you're bleeding, you might be uncomfortable, and then you're like, here, have this terrible sensory experience. It's a lot of things at once. And the parents and the kids who participated in that both reported that that was really helpful, and mainly in also like calming some anxiety about what was coming next, because there's a lot of unknown, right? And so it just stretches out the timeline for that. Um, Next one is we call it the what feels good activity. It's pretty straightforward. This is actually, if you just Google outline of person, that's where I pulled this visual from. This is not copyrighted in any way. This is a really good way to start to help kids recognize their sensory profile and help communicate that with other people. And then also comes in handy again when we talk about intimate and romantic relationships later on, to define from one person's own perspective what feels good for them. So I might say, okay, what feels really good to you? So I was thinking of myself when I did this one, like I like holding hands, I like shoulder rubs and shoulder squeezes, but do not dare touch my feet. That's just like a thing. Like I'm in socks even right now. It's too hot to be in socks, I will admit that, right? So doing that together, right? Everyone making their own body, like, okay, what feels good, what doesn't. So you can do that with, just as what feels good and what feels not good. You can also relate this to the circles program where people can touch you and not touch you, right? And at this age, at any age really, knowing what makes our body feel relaxed versus not relaxed is also really good for our like emotion regulation. Okay. Um, but here's probably what most of us are here for. Let's say you're doing this activity and someone's like, oh, it feels really good when like I touch my penis, right? Like, yes, great. That is, first of all, a wonderful open relation discussion to have. And so then that could be time like, yes, that's really true. Let's talk about where we can do that in the house and when we can do that, right? Instead of waiting to talk about, let's say, like masturbation after you walk in on somebody, right? That's, I think, an often a common occurrence, right? um so yeah, so this can grow into a lot of different activities as kids get older, but starting to use that model when folks are young gets them used to it, right? um Building on the different family relationships that we might have talked about when kids were young, talking about healthy relationships. So this is again an area we focus. We spend a lot of time talking about what to avoid, which I think is good and important, but also we have to talk about the green flags, right? One of my favorite quotes from a research assistant who's in our lab, who's autistic, said he, when he's on a first date, and this is in the dating space, I guess, but he's like, oh, like I know I'm supposed to ask, like, what do you do for work, and like, what do you like? He's like, but really what I need to be asking you is like, okay, like here's my stim, can you tolerate my stim, and can I tolerate yours, right? So talking about green flags, if people are open to talking about that, I think is a really nice example. um, there's another book called Intimate Relationships and Sexual Health that's a little bit older. It's from the early 2010s, I think, but has a lot of nice visuals of friendships, and then other ones that are more into romantic relationships, that just talks about the timeline of these, because that's something that comes up a lot with folks that I work with. Like, oh, I met someone and I think I might be in love with them, and now what happens, right? Because that's how you see it in the movies. You meet, you fall in love, right? You meet, you stand down there with the radio above your head. um so there's some real life examples in the book, but also like being like, okay, let's look at relationships around us and talk about like what this actually looks like, right? Like how long did you know, like maybe if you are a parent and you're partnered, or if you are mentoring a younger kid, like here's how other people I know have met. There's a lot of different ways to work this in, just to give some of those models. um which goes right along with sort of like media reflections. We'll talk about media literacy a little bit in the resource section, but kids are exposed so early to a lot of media online and things. So starting to incorporate that into like being really thoughtful about what sorts of like media kids are consuming. Okay. Um, so that's almost puberty. Then we head into adolescence. And this is where I say, everybody stay calm, right? Because this is where everybody sort of, panics a little bit. A lot is happening at the same time. So our list got a lot longer of what are some good things to talk about in adolescence, right? Thinking a little bit about, is there sex ed at school? Is it, is it happening? How is it happening? But I want to center us on a little bit of research that's happened in the past. In my lab, we did a survey of autistic adults and we asked like, hey, like in retrospect for folks 18 above, what do you wish you had learned right now that you've had some sort of life experience and maybe been in some more relationships? These are the top 4 topics that not only were top rated for people wanting more information about, but this was also significantly more requested than for non-autistic peers. So sexual orientation, gender identity, consent, and assertiveness, right? Um, this probably isn't a huge surprise to many folks on this call. I know it wasn't to us, but it was interesting to see in person. But when I just mentioned talking about boundaries, that's consent, right? That's assertiveness. So starting those things really, really early. But now that we're in adolescence, starting to think more about, instead of having rules like no, not here, never, we don't do this, yes, allowing opportunities for, romantic or intimate behaviors, right? When these conditions are met or sometimes. So really moving toward autonomy, right? This includes talking a lot about the failure that's natural and inherent in relationships that I mentioned before, right? So, if one thing goes wrong, that doesn't mean that you can never date again, right? That is something that happens. So making sure that we're exposing everyone to the good and the bad, right? Um, Also talking a little bit about identity, right? So we know that gender identity and sexual orientation is more diverse in autistic populations. There are more and more studies showing that in sort of population level studies, which means there's huge groups of people, right? Um, Oftentimes they also get questions about asexuality. So there are some studies that show there are slightly higher rates. So in the general population, if you really broadly define asexuality, so really not being interested in some aspects of romantic or intimate relationships, it's about 4% of like US adults. There's been a couple studies of autistic adults where it's been around 5%. And then there's been like one study just of autistic like women where it was around 30%. So it depends a lot on how you define asexuality. But good to arm people with all sorts of information, no matter what identity they sort of end up, landing on or moving through, which is more actually how sexuality and identity works with everybody. This is a resource I'd like to share. It's made by the Trans Student Educational Resources. Um, I actually have a couple of separate webinars that just talks about gender and sexual orientation and autism. So I will not give it its fair due right now. This is available in multiple languages. It is free. And one thing that we will oftentimes do in sex ed groups is be like, okay, let's talk about how we're sort of feeling about our own identity today. So gender identity, putting a little mark on the line where we are in terms of feeling female, male, or other genders, gender expression, how we're dressing, sex assigned at birth. So, the genetic question, physically attracted to and then emotionally attracted to. And we go through that exercise. So if you've got a kid who's thinking about that, this can be a good way to start that conversation. Um, Here's an activity I think good for everybody on the call. This is a very simple example of this, but a little bit of like a card sort to learn about what people might be interested in a relationship at any given time, right? So these are a pile of cards. It's sort of smaller of a larger part of set that we just make up in our group, depending on what we see the fit for the group is. But this is like, what do you want in someone that you date, right? Do you want someone who is a friend first? That's really important to some people, right? Do you want a partner who is funny? Do you really want a partner who likes to stay in? Do we have some fill in the blanks? Like, is there something in particular you really want a partner to be into? And then we have, depending on the group, we have different sections. So these are things I am definitely interested in. These are things I might be open to, but not looking for. And these are things that I do not want, right? Sometimes this is good, I think, just to learn where we all are in a given moment. But also, I oftentimes run groups for parents who have kids with developmental disabilities. And most of the time when we talk about dating, like, oh my God, my kid just wants to have sex. And sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's not. And so this can be a nice exercise to like get at that and actually calm the concerns that parents or caregivers might be having. But like, okay, but we haven't gone through all of safe sex stuff, so I don't want to talk about that yet. yes, this is the good one. There's a lot of different versions of this one. This is just an example of what we use. Like we cut them out and sort them into different piles. But yeah, that's a good one. It can also be fun to do with a partner. If you know, more for adults. I don't think I've done this with teens, with folks that they're dating. But yeah, just to get a sense of what you think about, right? Um, so let's talk about the neurodivergent love languages. This is one of my favorite things to chat about. So love languages more broadly are this way of connecting to others in romantic relationships. So oftentimes, like if someone says their love language is gifts, like they feel like someone loves them, or they show someone that they love them by giving them a present, right? So even if it's just like, oh, I grabbed you a Snickers bar at the store because I know you like those, that sort of thing. And so there's been some interesting research on, once we understand the love language of a partner, how that can maybe strengthen our relationship, or sort of understand, you know, how to affirm that more. So there are these 5 neurodivergent love languages, which I've included a couple of links down at the bottom if you're interested in learning more. There's definitely less established research on this because it's a newer, well, not newer concept, a newer thing that's been written down. But like the autistic community shares a lot of information about it, so you can see that down at the bottom. And so those 5 love languages are info dumping, so sharing a lot of details about one topic, like really going into detail. Parallel play or body doubling, so just sharing space together, being together in the same space, doing something, not necessarily doing something together. Spoon sharing or support swapping, so sharing some energy, like, oh, I do not have a lot of spoons, or sort of like emotional resources to do this day. Can you help with that, and offsetting that? um Please crush my soul back into my body, that is the name of it. And so that's like deep pressure, like, oh, can you just sort of like squish me, right? So you see that sort of sensory idea coming right out of there. That can be a really nice way to show love. And this one has the cutest name, penguin pebbling, right? So sharing small gifts or memes with neurodivergent friends or families that you know will be of interest to them, right? um so I bring this up now because in adolescence in particular, if people are starting to be interested in dating, and let's say you have, you know, friends or parents who are not autistic, they have a different dating around culture, right? And so sharing this information, be like, hey, this is how I show that I like someone, can be a really good way to just like broaden that discussion about relationships. It can also be a good way to keep an eye out for like how someone might be showing you affection, right? Like, oh, like they keep sending me these, you know, memes or stories about this one particular thing that they know that I like. And like, yeah, maybe we haven't gone to the movies, right? A very sort of like typical idea of a date, but I've done this other thing, and and that is actually showing a lot of love and affection. So centering the described experiences of autistic people and how we think about relationships can help us provide more support in that way. Um, so we've talked a little bit about healthy relationships. Virtual safety in porn is another big one. There'll be in the resource section, there's a website called the porn conversation. It's the pconversation.org. That comes from the perspective of many people have their first exposure to sexuality and relationships through porn nowadays, right? And so while porn in and of itself is not inherently a bad thing, being learning about healthy relationships through porn has its drawbacks, right? I mean, this whole curriculum that you know, we've incorporated into different parts of our programming, that's really helpful. We talked a little bit about identity. We talked a little bit about dating. I want to make sure we talk a little bit about young adulthood before we hop into resources. Um, but as you can see, a lot of different topics that would be good to talk about, and actually some good places to get some resources. So young adulthood and beyond. So to be clear, this page actually includes everything from adolescence and then also these additional topics. It's not that you are allowed off the hook, right? Meeting other people with romantic opportunities. So this is can be a huge barrier for folks, and for those folks listening, I would imagine some of the reason that you logged on might be related to this. Um, there's actually a project we're running that I'll talk about in a second here, but there are a lot of barriers to this, right? So especially for individuals who uh, have more support needs. So maybe they're living in a group home, or they're getting, you know, vocational supports or something like that. There are a lot of rules in those settings that limit their access to romantic relationships, right? So like group homes usually have a no touching policy, right? Usually we get the message that we cannot date people at work. So if your main places where you're spending a lot of time are work and home, that is a little bit, yeah, it's problematic, right? It doesn't leave a lot of opportunity, right? It's also the amount of, oftentimes, output, or like putting yourself out there that you need in order to find somebody to date is so huge and not something that we talk about. That people actually need a lot of opportunities to meet a lot of people in order to find someone that they might feel, romantically interested in, or, sexually interested in, anything like that. Um, yeah, so this is a huge problem. I don't have a quick solution to this, but there's a couple projects we're working on to try to take aim at that. Um, Online dating tips. So a lot of sex ed programs, I know one of the ones that we still use has a chapter on how to leave a good voicemail. And the joke in my research group is like, if someone leaves a voicemail, I'm never calling them back, right? So that's just not the 2025 reality. Um, but there are a lot of, actually, in the past couple of years, really good studies on online dating and how that works in autistic communities, because there's some slightly different rules and sort of styles, right? Which is hugely important to know if you're trying to navigate that. So, like, for example, they did a study of looking at profiles on, I forget if it was Match.com. It wasn't an autism specific dating site, it was sort of a broad dating site of autistic people. And they found that autistic men in particular had more negatively sort of valenced profiles. And what that means, they were listing things that they did not want, right? So, like, I don't want a smoker, right? Um, which might be true. There's nothing wrong with that, but you have such a brief amount of space to describe yourself that people who are on dating sites do not tend to respond well to more negative lists on dating profiles. So in order to get more chats going, the article mentioned, like, perhaps, not leading with what you don't want and leading with what you're looking for might result in more people sort of clicking on your profile. And then the more people you chat with, that filters down to more people that might actually be good matches. So things like that, right? Um, we also, and this is my huge problem with sexuality and relationship information totally, is that we don't talk about the full lifespan of, you as a sexual and intimate and romantic relationship person, right? We don't talk about pregnancy at all. Everything is about how to avoid pregnancy, which makes sense when people are young, but in young adulthood, where are you supposed to get that information, right? There's no centralized spot for that. Um, Parenting, right? I work with a lot of autistic parents who are like, gosh, I would really like some advice on how to balance like my sensory needs and having a toddler who you may or may not be able to hear upstairs here, right? Um, that's there's not a good spot for that. And then things like menopause, like we don't know a lot about menopause in autistic women in particular, and how that's experienced and how that might impact, interrelate with, mental health, with sensory symptoms, anything like that. So just things to think about, that we have to be really intentional about finding resources for this area, because they're not going to be handed to us. Not that they're really handed to us in these other areas, but all right. So I'm going to do what I call research sampler, because I made it one slide. No, I made it two slides. I tried to make it one slide, but I made it really brief because there's a lot going on, right? And I just want you to know that and be aware of it. You can look up more of it, or, reach out to me afterward if you're interested. Um, so I'll actually lead with, we have an Instagram account at Korean Lab, and a Facebook account where we share study announcements. So if you're interested in hearing about some of these, there's more details there, because I won't go into great detail here. But the big one I want to mention is called Let's Make a Match, right? So this is Massachusetts specific at the moment. We got a grant from Bailey's team for autism to run a couple of matchmaking activities across the state this fall. We did a pilot of this last year at Work Inc. over in Dorchester, where folks come. We have a very sensory friendly event where people meet other adults who are interested in dating. They indicate if there's someone they might be romantically interested in, and then we match them if they are. And then the grant actually supports us developing a manual to train dating coaches, right? So just like you would get services in any other, like a job coach or something like that, this would be like a dating specific coach, to help make sure that people have access to dating other people. And then if they have questions, they've got someone to sort of check in with, or like even less questions, but like, hey, I want to meet this person for a date, but I am reliant on other people for my transportation. Like, how can we make that happen? So to let people do that with more autonomy, right? So there's someone dedicated to that role. Um, right now, we are interviewing autistic adults just to make sure that we have things in the manual for the dating coaches that would be helpful. So that's where that is. So keep an eye out for that. Hopefully, we're going to do one in Boston, one in Worcester, and then I think one more in like northwestern Mass. We're still trying to find a location, but that's exciting. Um, Project KISS is a study we've been running, both at Tufts and at Boston Children's, where we are developing sexual health measures for autistic adults, because most of the measures we use have been developed for other neurotypes and not included autistic people. So people come in and we do some eye tracking tests. We ask them to like answer different relationship questions so that we have more tools to actually study sexuality and intimacy in really affirming ways. So we're almost done with that, but if you're interested in that's happening, we have a site in Medford and a site in Brookline. And we're wrapping up data collection on that. And then we're also looking at gender and autism. So we know that gender is a lot more diverse for autistic adults. We don't know much about like the development of this idea of gender. There's great research on how kids think about gender when they're young that is not related to autism. So right now we have actually a purely neurodivergent gender non-conforming team of tough students who are interviewing autistic children over Zoom. So those can be from anywhere to just ask them about like their experiences with gender. And they phrase it in more kid-friendly ways. We do like an activity and parents fill out some questionnaires. But if you're interested in helping with that type of work, we're in that right now. And that's been a lot of fun. The interviews so cute, as I'm sure you can imagine. Um, I did my research sampler in 2 minutes. I'm actually really proud of myself, guys. So let's talk a little bit about resources, and I'm gonna limit myself to like 3 or 4 minutes here, which is plenty of time, because in the slides these will all be here. So these are things that you would need to sort of dig into more anyway as you move forward. Um, this first one is building a care team. This is more geared toward the parents on the call. Sex ed oftentimes doesn't happen because, like I said, it doesn't have an assigned home, right? This is a form that's my practice website, pegasuscaps.com. It's under resources. It's free. You don't even have to enter your email or anything. It's just like a PDF. You could also recreate this on your own with no difficulty. Um, but this is just the idea, listing out particular topics that you want to be covered and putting them under the person who you think is going to cover them, and then sharing this list with those people, right? And I put a little mark here because this shouldn't just say parents, it should say who specifically is going to talk about this, right? Because otherwise you think someone else is doing it. Yeah, so this is one way to do this. And then making a plan to revisit this, maybe at, birthday time, maybe at end of school, maybe on Valentine's Day, right? You can make a cute little connection. Um, yes, just to make sure you're continuing to move forward and sharing information in a way that's helpful for your child. Okay. Um, there's also a full resource list, and I put this on a sort of construction-based slide. So on Monday, actually, I'm switching to work at the Shriver Center at UMass. I'm taking my research program from Tufts and bringing it over to Shriver, also to build an adult program in the autism clinic there, which I'm super excited about. So right now, on my research site at Tufts, we have this PDF of resources that we've compiled over the years. That website will be moving to UMass. So I would say if you're interested in this, and I'll share the link, you can download the PDF, but also in, I would say, a couple of weeks, if you look up my name in Shriver Center, I'm moving my whole website over there. So this will be available again soon, just briefly inaccessible for a few weeks coming up. Okay. Um, so let's see, there are a couple other things I wanted to show you, right? Talking about like someone's, having a period, what this feels like, a nice visual way to do that. I've just always really liked this visual. So here's when your actual period is happening. You're feeling really good here. You're very easily able to get pregnant here. Here's where your boobs might be hurting, right? So making this is like a nice, I think, template for talking about, periods in a way that's really visually accessible. Um, there's a book called Jed Baker's Preparing for Life that has a lot of things in it that's related to autism. Actually, I think the title still talks about Asperger's. It's an older book, but the format of it is like, an activity to do together, and then a description of how you could sort of approach the activity. But there's a couple sections on dating, which I really like. So if you are someone who really likes like a clear, like, here's what to do, here's what not to do, that's the format of a lot of the activities. So this one is, getting ready for a date, what to do, what not to do. There's other things like how to ask someone on a date, how to tell if someone likes you. These, we all have attempts at trying to make these a little bit more accessible, but that's one easy book. You can just get that off of it's sold at most places, so an easy one to access. The other one that I realized I put on a slide but didn't say out loud, which is a mistake, is the Autism Relationships Workbook, which is written by an autistic self-advocate and a psychologist who actually don't know if she's a self-advocate or not. But it is great. It talks about relationships really broadly, and then also has some like self-reflection exercises, but all the way from family relationships, friendships, romantic relationships, and marriage. So there's a whole range of those. There's also in Massachusetts through AANE, which is our sort of big group related to autism in adulthood in the area. They have a neurodivergent couples clinic. So, if you are in a couple where two people are autistic or one person autistic and one person isn't, you're working with a therapist who understands that, which can be really, really hard. Many therapists are not trained in understanding autism. Okay? And then I'll leave. This is like flow chart I made with a patient once who we've shared here. With their permission. But how do we decide if someone likes you? Which was, tough to break down, but we took our best shot at it. Okay. So let me pause there because I think we have like a couple of questions just to make sure we have time for that. But here's just a little bit of contact information for me. Study announcements right now, the Crehan Lab on Facebook and Instagram, that won't change on Monday, so that will be consistent. Usually I have the website under here, but that's under construction. And then some of the parent groups that I talked about are more resources I share through my clinical practice, which is the Pegasus Consulting Assessment and Psychological Services. So let me stop sharing so I can answer some questions. But I so appreciate your coming and listening. Yeah, because it's important, right? Love is good for us in a lot of ways. So how can we navigate that healthfully and in yeah, just supportive ways? I think it's really important.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crehan. I think we probably have time for maybe like one question. But I think you actually answered a ton of questions throughout that people had. So I think that's all good that we only have a little bit of time. But I think one thing that could maybe be answered for both parents talking to their children with autism and then also for autistic adults. So yeah, again, it might be two separate answers, but how can parents talk to their kids about differentiating between friendship feelings and romantic feelings and how to maybe act upon those, like maybe going back to those circles, like what is appropriate with friends and again, if you maybe can sort of tweak the answer for adults as well, because I know we have quite a few adults on the call.
Yes, yeah. How to tell if someone likes you.
Yeah.
Like the hardest question, right? Because you can't know for sure, right? That's going to be part of the discussion. Be like, we have to take our best guesses. So what are our green light indicators? Like they're responding to you. Like, for like, I think sometimes talk about like getting butterflies in your stomach, but that, if that's not an experience that makes sense to you, that's not going to be good, right? Like, do you look forward to talking to them? You can also, because you won't necessarily know, try to start dating or like, having more contact with them or talk about more personal things. And then if that doesn't feel right, you can walk it back, or you can always change your mind. Yes. And then the second part of it being like, okay, what responsiveness are you getting from this person? And that can help us dictate. So I know it was up really briefly, but because the slides will be shared, the flow chart of like how to decide if someone likes you, like you could remake that for yourself with a friend. Yeah,